Nobody thought twice about it at first. A 13-year-old boy out along the muddy edge of Coldwater Creek before school, digging holes with a borrowed spade in the gray half-light before sunrise. His boots were already ruined by the time his mother called him in for breakfast, mud caked past the ankle, socks soaked through. His hands blistered by Tuesday, the skin cracking at the base of his thumb from gripping the spade wrong. By Thursday, the neighbors had noticed, the way neighbors always eventually notice anything strange enough to talk about at the feed store. Everett Crane didn't explain himself. He just kept digging. He'd hauled in bundles of willow whips, those long, flexible shoots cut from mature trees, bound together with baling twine so they wouldn't scatter in the truck bed, and he was pressing them into the soft soil right along the bank of the creek, one every few feet, dozens of them, working his way from the old fence post near the pasture gate all the way to the wide curve where the water slowed in summer. People in Casey County, Kentucky, had seen plenty of strange things over the years, but a boy planting bare, leafless shade trees along a flood-prone creek in late autumn, with winter coming in hard and nothing on the sticks but bark, was something else entirely. That was something people actually talked about. If stories like this one, or stories of quiet wisdom, patience, and real farming lessons, mean something to you, hit subscribe and join our growing farming family. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to welcome you. Everett Crane was the second of 4 children on a tobacco and cattle farm that had been in the family since his great-grandfather broke ground on it in 1908, the kind of place where the family's whole history was written into the land itself if you knew where to look. His father, Dale Crane, was a practical man. Fair, hard-working, not given to wasted motion of any kind, the sort of man who could tell you exactly how many bales a field would yield just by walking it once. His mother, Ruth Ann, kept the books and raised the children and somehow, impossibly, still found time to grow the best kitchen garden in the county. A fact she never mentioned but that everyone at the church potluck quietly acknowledged with their forks. Everett was not the loudest Crane. His older brother, Micah, got the ribbons at the county fair, year after year, for hogs raised fat and proud. His younger sister, Lena, got the grades, straight A's that Ruth and pinned to the refrigerator like small trophies. But Everett was the one who walked the fence line every single Sunday morning, not because anyone asked him to, but because he genuinely liked to see what had changed since the week before. He was the one who noticed, one spring, that the south field drained slower than it used to, weeks before anyone else caught the difference. He was the one who found a dead calf and traced the trouble back to a loose electrical wire 3 full days before anyone else spotted it, working the problem backward with a patience that unsettled some of the adults who watched him do it. He didn't talk much about what he noticed. He just watched and filed things away the way some people collect stamps or coins. The plantings started the October after Everett turned 13. He'd asked his father for permission to work the creek bank, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hands shoved in his pockets, working up the nerve for most of a week before he actually asked. Dale Crane had looked at him for a long moment, the particular long moment a father gives a son when he's deciding whether to ask more questions or simply trust the boy, and said, "Long as you're not neglecting your chores." That was all the blessing Everett needed. He ordered willow whips from a conservation nursery 2 counties over, paying for them himself with money he'd saved from helping bale hay for the Aches farm down the road, work that left his palms rough and his shoulders sore for a boy his age. When the bundle finally arrived, tied and wrapped in damp burlap, his neighbor Harlan Beecham happened to be driving past and leaned on the fence post to squint at the sticks piled in the truck bed. "What in the world are those?" he asked. "Willows," Everett said. "For shade." "Sort of." Harlan scratched his jaw, said nothing more, and drove on. But he told his wife that evening, over supper, that the Crane boy was out there planting sticks in the mud, and she laughed and said that sounded about right for him, the Crane boy who noticed things nobody else bothered to. Old Gus Whitfield drove by on his tractor a few days later, slowed down and called over the engine noise, "Boy, you know those creek banks flood out every few years. Anything you plant there is going to wash straight to Tennessee." Everett nodded politely, didn't argue, and kept pressing whips into the ground, one after another, the rhythm of it becoming almost meditative by the third day. His own father watched from a distance once or twice that first week, neither encouraging nor discouraging, arms crossed, saying nothing. Ruth and asked him at dinner one evening what exactly he was hoping to grow out there. Everett told her he'd explain when there was something worth explaining. Nobody pushed him further. That was simply the kind of family they were, patient with each other in a way that didn't always need words attached to it. What nobody knew, not even Dale, was where Everett had actually gotten the idea in the first place. The previous summer, during the 2 weeks he'd stayed with his maternal grandfather, Lester Bowen, over in Bourbon County, something had shifted in him. Lester was a former soil conservation technician who'd spent 30 years helping farmers stop losing ground they couldn't afford to lose. A career's worth of quiet, unglamorous expertise most people in Bourbon County took entirely for granted. He was 74 that summer, mostly retired, but his mind stayed sharp as a draw knife, cutting straight through to the point of things. One evening, the two of them had walked down to a neighbor's ruined creek bank, the kind of erosion that looked like someone had taken a spoon to the earth and scooped away years of accumulated ground in a single bad season. Lester had stood there quietly for a long while, hands in his pockets, studying the raw, crumbling edge before he finally spoke. "You know what fixes this?" Everett didn't know. "Willows," Lester said. "Plant them close along the bank. Give them 2-3 years. Roots go down deeper than you'd think. Lace themselves right into the soil, anchor the whole bank from underneath. Water can rise and push and pull all it wants, but those roots hold the structure together. They slow the water down right along the edge, catch the sediment before it can wash off, keep the bank from caving in on itself." He'd handed Everett a thin booklet from the County Extension Service, printed on cheap paper gone soft at the edges from years of handling, streambank stabilization using native vegetation. Everett had read it twice on the bus ride home, the pages already starting to fall apart at the fold by the second reading. What Lester had described was real, practiced conservation science, not folk wisdom dressed up to sound clever. Willows, particularly black willow, native to much of the American South and Midwest, were among the most effective natural tools available for protecting stream banks from erosion. Their root systems grew aggressive and fibrous, colonizing moist soil quickly and thoroughly. They flexed under pressure instead of breaking outright, which meant that planted densely along a creek bank, they worked together almost like a mesh woven beneath the surface, binding loose soil against the lateral, grinding force of moving water in a way that no rigid structure ever could. Everett had understood it the way only a boy who walks fence lines every Sunday morning truly understands things. Not as abstract theory memorized for a test, but as something that would actually matter someday, in a way he couldn't yet fully picture but trusted completely. The first winter was brutal to the young willows. A hard freeze in January killed several of the whips outright, the bark splitting and the wood inside going black and dead. A section of the herd found a gap in the temporary fencing Everett had built and trampled a dozen more of his plantings flat before he even discovered the damage, walking out one gray morning to find hoofprints pressed deep into what should have been his neat row of chutes. He repaired the fence himself, hauling posts and stretching wire in the cold, and replaced the trampled whips with fresh cuttings taken from the surviving original stock, rooting them in buckets of creek water in the barn through the worst of the remaining winter, checking them every evening the way some kids check on a science fair project. In May, aphids hit the new growth hard, curling the tender young leaves and stunting what little progress the whips had made. Everett treated what he could with a homemade soap spray Ruth and helped him mix. Some he lost anyway. Gus Whitfield passed by again that early summer, saw the patchy, struggling saplings, thin, uneven, more gaps than growth, and shook his head. "Might as well have planted broom handles," he said, not unkindly, more resigned than mocking. There were days, if Everett was honest with himself, when he genuinely wondered if Gus was right. The whips that had survived the freeze were pencil-thin and slow, nothing like the thick, established roots Lester had described. A late summer dry spell turned the creek low and listless, exposed banks cracking in the relentless heat. Two of the saplings nearest the curve simply gave up and went brown, leaves curling to nothing within a week. Everett pulled them and replanted with fresh cuttings, pressing them deeper into the ground this time, tamping the soil tight around each one with the heel of his boot, a small ritual he repeated dozens of times that summer without complaint. His brother Micah watched him one afternoon, arms crossed, and said, "You know they're just trees, right? The creek's going to do what it wants regardless." Everett didn't answer. He just kept tamping. The second year was better. The willows that had actually survived that first brutal winter began putting down serious roots, the kind Lester had promised, and by midsummer you could see them clearly. A ragged but steadily thickening line of green tracing the length of Coldwater Creek, long leaves trailing in the current whenever the water ran high after a storm. Still, most people in the county didn't give them a second thought. A boy's stubborn hobby, mostly forgotten between mentions at the feed store. The summer Everett turned 15 was one of the driest in memory across that whole stretch of Kentucky. And then, as though the sky had decided to make up for lost time all at once, it rained for 11 straight days that October. Not constantly, not a violent deluge, but steady, relentless, the kind of rain that soaks into everything until the ground simply cannot hold another single drop. Old Rufus Dinkins, who farmed the bottomland 2 miles east, told Dale Crane at the co-op that the creek was running higher than he'd seen it since 1993. His voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who already suspected what was coming. Dale went home that evening and checked his own banks. The water ran deep, fast, and brown with churned sediment. The birds had been behaving strangely all week. The killdeer that nested near the creek had moved their feeding ground uphill 3 full days earlier, a detail Everett had noticed and filed away without mentioning it to anyone, the way he filed most things away. He'd walked the willow line twice the day before the worst of it arrived, pressing his hand flat against each trunk, feeling the roots pulled tight beneath the soil, taut as cables under real load, a sensation that told him more than any weather report could. The county issued a flood advisory that afternoon. Dale nailed the notice to the barn door without a word. The family ate supper quietly that night, listening to rain hammer steadily against the tin roof overhead. Nobody saying much of anything. Came hard on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, Coldwater Creek had jumped its banks in 4 separate places between the Whitfield farm and the Aches farm to the east. Gus Whitfield lost 60 feet of bank on his north pasture. Simply gone, a ragged new edge sitting where his fence line used to run, topsoil carried off downstream in thick brown sheets that would take a generation to rebuild. 3 of the Aches fence lines went down entirely, posts and tangled wire washing 200 yards downstream into a debris pile nobody wanted to untangle. The low road connecting the 2 farms sat underwater until Saturday afternoon. Rufus Dinkins lost the better part of a hay meadow he'd spent 12 careful years building up, dark, loose, well-tended soil that the floodwater simply took, fast and total. He stood at the ragged edge of what remained that Friday afternoon, hands shoved deep in his pockets, and didn't say anything for a long time. But on the Crane farm, Coldwater Creek had stayed closer to its channel. Not perfectly, the water had spread into the low edge of the south pasture, soaking ground that would need a few days to dry out. But the bank itself, the long stretch where Everett had planted 2 years before, had held. Where every neighboring bank showed raw, crumbling earth torn open by the flood, the Crane bank showed willow roots, exposed in places, yes, bent and thick with mud, but still gripping the soil tight, still holding the line. The channel hadn't shifted an inch. The topsoil directly behind the willow line remained largely intact, dark and undisturbed, exactly where it had been for generations. The reason was precisely what Lester Bowen had described that quiet summer evening in Bourbon County. The willow roots had laced themselves through the bank's subsoil over 2 full years, creating something close to a living net beneath the surface. When the floodwater rose and pushed laterally against the bank with everything it had, it met resistance. Not from some hard, brittle structure that would eventually crack and give way all at once, but from something flexible and fibrous that bent without ever fully breaking. Sediment that would have peeled away in sheets, the way it had on every other farm along that stretch of creek. instead stayed held in place. The bank's structural integrity, quietly reinforced by 2 years of patient root growth, had absorbed what should have been catastrophic erosion and simply refused to let go. Nobody made a speech about it. That wasn't how things worked in Casey County. Gus Whitfield came over the following Monday to look at the damage, or rather, to look at the conspicuous lack of it, boots still caked with mud from his own ruined pasture. He stood at the edge of the Crane bank for a long time, saying almost nothing. Eventually he asked Everett, flat out, where exactly he'd gotten the Willows. Everett told him about the conservation nursery 2 counties over, and wrote the name down carefully on a torn scrap of paper. Gus folded it into his chest pocket without another word. The following spring, Harlan Beecham planted a full row of willows along his own section of the creek. The year after that, so did the Aches family. Nobody announced it, nobody made it official. It simply spread the way useful things tend to spread in small farming communities, quietly through observation and genuine need, one neighbor watching another and finally deciding to trust what their own eyes had shown them. Everett Crane never once told anyone he'd known all along that it would work. He didn't need to. The creek bank said it for him, plainly, in a language everyone in that county understood without needing translation. There's a line from Wendell Berry that stays with you when you think about what happened on that farm. The soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Everett hadn't set out to be wise about anything. He'd simply been trying to protect something real. A piece of ground his family had worked for 4 generations. A creek bank that everyone else had quietly accepted as temporary, doomed, not worth the effort of saving. He'd learned from someone older and wiser than himself that the land will hold, genuinely hold, if you give it the right tools and enough patient time to work. The willows are still there today. They're taller now, and the roots go deeper with every passing year. That's not a metaphor dressed up for effect. It's simply how willows work, the same way it's always worked, for as long as anyone's bothered to plant them properly and wait. And sometimes the most practical thing a person can do looks completely foolish right up until the exact moment the water finally rises and proves them right. Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.